You are listening to the Enormocast.
La Sportiva is celebrating the 20th anniversary of the Mira, the greatest climbing shoe ever made, by messing with it. Careful, Sportiva. Careful. But using input from Adam Ondra, they've come up with the Mira 20. The Mira 20 is the same precise toe of the Mira with a more supportive and aggressive heel for a shoe so precise that Adam Ondra once carved a Christmas turkey with only a pair of Mira 20s and a dull ice pick. One of these days, Adam Ondra is going to ask me to stop using his name in these ads. But until that happens, Adam Ondra. Mira 20s are available only this year in a limited edition and only at retailers. But you can go to Sportiva.com for more information on the shoe and to find out where you can get a pair. And don't worry, the good old-fashioned Miras are still around too. Hey climbers, that rock that you lovingly caress every weekend is just never going to love you back. Of course, it's never going to suddenly ask you what you're thinking right now either. But devoting even a tenth of that energy into an actual human relationship might be a better bet in terms of love and companionship, no matter what your alpinist friends say. Peter W. Gilroy is here to help. Climber and jewelry maker, Peter can hook you up with just the right gift for that human in your life who just smiles when you get home late from the crag, or who says, "No, you're still hot," when you're clearly chubby and out of shape and stink of failure, or who's still belaying you even though you're falling lower and lower on your proj. Inspired by the rocks we climb and the mountains we love, Peter's jewelry and accessories might be just the thing to convince your significant other that you're not an obsessive crazy person in love with inanimate objects. So go to peterwgilroy.com and enter Enormo at checkout for a discount on art you can wear and to help the Enormocast.
We gotta get
Listen, where are you playing in town? Are you playing here?
We're doing the Enormo Dome, whatever it is. It's terrific.
Oh,
It's
yeah,
a
big
house. We
place,
sold
that
it
side
out.
of town. That's a
Very
big
nice.
place. You sold
What's
it
that,
out.
20,000 seats? We really should.
Look, you better get up there before you panic. Those pens are loose. You're very good. I have really enjoyed climbing with you. We'll make it. I don't think so. But we shall continue with style. Bad weather. Now or later, anytime for climbing.
Today's show is brought to you by Black Diamond Equipment, with support from Maxim Ropes.
And the fine folks at La Sportiva. And don't forget our charter sponsor, Bonfire Coffee. Go to bonfirecoffee.com and enter Enormo at checkout for a discount on great coffee and to support the Enormocast.
And now back to the show.
Hello and welcome to the Enormocast. This is your host, Chris Kalous. It is May 22nd, about 9 o'clock here in Colorado. This is episode 129 of the Enormocast, a conversation with alpinist Steve Swenson. And not much to tell you here at the Enormocast this time around. No exciting news, just banging out episodes. 2 a month since December 2011. I'm only off the pace by 3 episodes in 5.5 years. I can't believe it myself. I know where 2 of them went. I don't know where the third one went. But one of these days, maybe I'll just drop a 3-pack to get back up to speed. I can't believe it. I can't believe I've pulled it off. So I'm patting myself on the back in podcast land right now for doing this. All face-to-face. I don't know why that's important. I just made it a rule. I think it is somehow. But I'm sure someone more talented can pull off just as good an interview on Skype as I can do face-to-face. But I've insisted upon it, and it's worked out so far. People are more interested in doing the show because of you guys making it popular. It's a thing, so people get in touch now. Publicists get in touch. Athletes get in touch. People want to do the show. And you guys actually get in touch and help me find folks and get in touch with them to do the show. So lots of touching here at the Enormocast. Hands, touching me, touching you. The Enormocast, the virtual grope. The only little bit of news is myself and the entourage will probably head up to Lander next month, or actually in July, July 13th, I think, through the 16th. We don't have anything really set in stone, but it looks like we're headed up there again. So if you're interested in that thing and you're going to be out there, hopefully we'll run into you up there in Lander at the International Climbing Festival. All right, let's get going then. Steve Swenson. Man, this guy's a legend. And he may not be one of those climbers who are a household name, but if you talk to folks who climb in the big mountains in Southeast Asia, they'll know and admire and maybe even revere Steve Swenson. He's been at it for 40-some years and has managed to keep a balanced life of family, of career, and of climbing expeditions almost yearly in that time. Plus, he's managed to keep his psyche for going up high and getting at altitude and getting into those intense situations up there. He just stays psyched for it. You know, a lot of really good climbers have their day, and it sort of passes as they either burn out or just kind of read the writing on the wall. But somehow Steve has stayed psyched and maybe most importantly, stayed alive up there in the mountains. I also want to do a quick plug for Steve's book, Karakoram, Climbing Through the Kashmir Conflict. It's how he ended up in Carbondale. He's on a promotional tour for the book before he heads off for yet another expedition to Southeast Asia. It's an astounding story of climbing in that region from when it reopened through the Kashmir conflict with India, post 9/11 world, right up until now. Lots of unrest in the area, and Steve's witnessed and climbed through it all. So check that out at Mountaineers Books, and also look for Steve on the road. A couple more dates before he leaves for Pakistan, and then I think he's back on the road in the fall. So look for him coming to your town, AAC event or anything like that. This guy has a lot of wisdom, which we're going to find out right now. So let's talk to Steve Swenson. Black Diamond is a proud sponsor of the Enormocast, so go ahead and check out the new spring goods at blackdiamondequipment.com, or better yet, your local shop. New headlamps, new lightweight outerwear like the Gore-Tex Liquid Point Shell and the Alpine Start hoodie, which incidentally I recently dropped in the black. If anybody found it, enjoy my perma stink of fear. I've also really started to dig the Alpine Glow Sun hoodie, a breathable wicking hoodie to hide from the brutal burning orb. Who knew that standing around with your shirt off or roasting under Sauron's eye wasn't the best way to stay cool? It's all there at blackdiamondequipment.com or your local shop. Support the Enormocast by checking out Black Diamond's new spring line.
When I first started climbing in South Asia and then not knowing what the hell we were doing to kind of figuring it out, but taking a while because it takes a while. It's complicated.
Right.
Then having a bunch of success, and then at the end of the book really kind of talking more about kind of sort of some of the security issues now in the Karakoram, and then just kind of, passing the torch, like to these young guys that I'm hanging out with, like Graham and Scott and Chris and people like that who are keen to go there, but are, psyched to go with me because I kind of know what to do.
So I talked to Graham recently, and that's not been put out yet, but that, he was definitely shaking his head about how hooking up with you just took so much fear out of the logistics and everything else. And reading the book, just your casual comments about 200 loads needed to be carried in, or 2,000 pounds of this, or you said in one point in the book 250 pounds of food was being eaten a day by your whole crew of porters and you guys. And those sorts of numbers, as just a rock climber and someone who's gone on expeditions, that I call them that, means I got on an airplane and went somewhere. It almost makes me uncomfortable to think about the logistic part of that. And we can just start there, because I want to talk about your career. And since you just talked about how you were a beginner and maybe have arrived at this place of wisdom, is there something in your brain you think that makes you good at that? I mean, you're an engineer.
For sure.
When you put yourself towards this logistic thing.
Oh yeah, I mean, when I first started with this stuff, it was, I've kind of had that sort of a brain, kind of figuring out logistics and, numbers and how it all adds up. And for example, the first expedition that we went on going into the Baltoro, where the last village it's a 14-day trek to get in there, and the last village is 4 days into the trek, so you have to feed all of your porters for hiking for 10 days. Well, if you needed 50 loads of stuff to go to your base camp for you to be there for a couple of months, it takes 100 porters to get you there, because it's one porter to carry food for the porter that's going to get there, and then every day, you're eating so much food, you're laying off about 5 guys a day, and we didn't have that much money. So we had to kind of calculate that stuff pretty tight, because porters were our biggest expense. So
right.
That's just kind of an example of, so I just kind of made up the equations, for calculating how much it would cost for all of the porters based on how much stuff we had to go to base camp, and then backed into it from there. And in my career as an engineer, actually, this kind of stuff is pretty easy, actually, compared to engineering stuff that I did, which is actually way more complicated.
And when you're talking about your career as an engineer, are you one of the guys that are like more of a project manager as well? Are you like a detail guy, or are you both?
Well, in my career, I spent 35 years as an engineering consultant in water resources kind of stuff. So I did everything from, it was mostly environmental, kind of dealing with water quality, wastewater, then water supply, and then, kind of runoff from the land. And so, big computer models of watersheds and hydraulic models of river and channel systems, that's kind of what I did. And when I was young, I started up just guy at the desk, running the numbers and helping to write reports. And I kind of, by the time I was, 10 or 15 years into my career, I was managing projects. Then I kind of realized that a lot of the work I was doing, most of the work I was doing was for municipal clients, and they all needed money. And they all had to get money from their elected officials, and a lot of the work we were doing, planning, we were doing those projects that needed to be done, or things, they all needed money to implement them. And so if we didn't have money, these things would just sit on the shelf and nothing would get done. So about the last 10 years of my career, I spent working on utility finance with my public works clients and elected officials.
So is that like crossover to raising money for these expeditions?
Well, dealing with politicians and, kind of that whole stakeholder process, so that everybody feels good to pay more fees for something, which nobody ever wants to do, was about as, that's never easy.
Right.
And raising money for the expeditions, I don't think that was that hard, because these trips we did were pretty small.
Sure.
We weren't doing these big. I kind of came into that sort of Himalayan climbing scene when the expeditions were sort of leaving that big national expedition. You'd get invited, and there was like 30 climbers and these huge things. When we climbed K2 in 1990, there was 4 of us, and we organized our own trips. They were complicated. They could be expensive, but sort of between what we put into it ourselves in terms of cash, and we usually had 1 or 2 sponsors, and sometimes they'd be kind of crazy. One of our trips, it was like a sardine company. Just somebody knew this guy, and he threw in like $20,000.
Oh,
and
nice.
Like, they could be sort of random.
Do you like sardines?
I like sardines.
Yeah, me too, actually.
Yeah.
Not a bad mountaineering sponsor.
Yeah.
Well, this isn't I'm glad you switched it back to climbing, because this is not a municipal water engineering podcast, although I'm sure there's one out there for people if they want to find it. There's a podcast for everything.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about your career. When you were saying these early expeditions, when was the first expedition that you consider like a full-on proper expedition?
To South Asia.
Yeah, to South Asia.
We had a number of expeditions to Alaska and things like that before, but the first one to South Asia, and it's the first trip I talk about in the book that I wrote, Karakoram, Climbing Through the Kashmir Conflict, is Gasherbrum 4 in 1980.
Okay.
And, the reason we went there was because looking through books and doing research, it's such an incredibly beautiful mountain. That west face of Gasherbrum 4, the way it kind of shines up there at the head of the Baltoro Glacier, it's just iconic. And also, at that time in 1980, the Karakoram had been recently reopened to foreigners to go climbing there after about over a decade of being closed because of the conflict between India and Pakistan over Kashmir. And the Karakoram Range sits smack in the middle of all these disputed, borders or lines of control between India and Pakistan and China. So, in some ways we were taking advantage of the fact that, the area is contested, and it created this sort of candy store of first ascents and new routes for us because the closures had created this kind of political wilderness that still exists till today. So there's a lot more opportunities for doing new things there than other parts of South Asia where it's been open, to foreigners for many years.
Do you have a sense of why they opened it? Do they have does the government or whoever decided this have a sense of the idea of tourists bringing commerce, or do you have any idea why they opened it? Because it seems like it would be easier just to keep it closed.
Well, I think the major reason why they reopened it was because it was a way for these countries that were controlling these areas to be able to justify their territorial claims.
Okay.
So, for example, if you're a Pakistani government official and you can give a permit to a foreigner to go climbing here, then that's telling the world that we own this and we control it, and we're giving permits and for people to go there. I think that there was certainly economic reasons and people argued that. But if I was going to wager on that, I don't think they would care as much about that, because those government officials, I've seen them do other things, since then, where they completely ignored, economic development issues for other political reasons or security reasons. So I think it was completely like, this is ours, and we want to show the world this is ours.
Do you think there's a serious influx of foreign capital or money or anything from expeditions, or is it really just a drop in the bucket? Is there a serious enough input, do you think, to
well,
really
it
make
could
much of a
in the
difference?
Karakoram. Well, certainly places like Nepal, it's huge.
Right.
But in the Karakoram, it's not, because, and especially recently, because of all the political instability, it's pretty much devastated the tourist economy in the northern areas. I mean, 9/11 was a big blow to them, and then in 2013 there was a number of militants that came in from the tribal areas to the west and massacred a bunch of climbers at Nanga Parbat base camp. And then after that happened, it's like no one's going. And so that economy could, if these other things weren't going on, it could be tremendous for those local people who are quite poor. But it hasn't, and it's been such a big up and down. It's like they're having a great recession. Every few years that one of these incidents happens. Of terrorism or like a international incident like 9/11. So they're kind of tired. I think these people and local people up in the northern areas there in Gilgit-Baltistan, they're tired of that, and they're trying to diversify their economy and do some other things.
Such as, is there?
Well,
the opportunity?
The sad thing about it is their plan seems to be that they really are investing a lot in education for their kids. So, and what that really means is that if their kids get more educated, they leave, and they go to the bigger cities in Pakistan to work and send money back to the villages. So so I think over time those villages will just kind of depopulate themselves.
That year that attack happened, you said it was 2013.
Yeah.
Did you have an expedition there that year?
No.
Did you cancel one, or were you just not? That just didn't happen to be your year?
I'm trying to remember when that would have been. No, I didn't have one planned for that year.
Right. I was just curious if maybe it even scared you off, or made you get on a plane and get out of there.
No. Jesse was there. Jesse Huey.
Right.
And he came back.
I do remember that. Yeah, it's serious business. It was so shocking because you just don't include those two things together, the climbing ideal. And
I think what a lot of people don't realize is Nanga Parbat sits way to the west of the Karakoram. In fact, it's technically not part of the Karakoram. It's on the other side of the Indus River. So it's really the westernmost mountain in the Himalayas. The very eastern mountain in the Himalayas is way over 1,500 miles, to the east. And but further north in the Karakoram and Gilgit-Baltistan, all those people up there are super friendly and peaceful. They're all either Baltis or Burakashi people that are Shias, and all the bad guys over there are Sunnis, and they're part of a tribe that are called Pashtuns. And Nanga Parbat is right near those areas where the Pashtuns are, and that's why you have security concerns there. If you fly from Islamabad to Skardu or Gilgit, where you get up into Gilgit-Baltistan, you're completely safe. I would recommend to people that say, should I go climbing there? I said, if you get up there in the mountains in Gilgit-Baltistan, you're totally fine. Right. You just have to get up there and don't take the road anymore. I don't think the Karakoram Highway is safe anymore.
Right.
But if you fly up there, you're totally fine.
Mm-hmm. Is it substantially less expensive to just try to get driven up there?
No. The issue is that the flights will only go if the weather's good.
Okay.
And they fly big jet. They fly Airbus A320s into Skardu every day now in the summer, so they don't get a backlog. But they'll only fly if it's visual conditions. And if you got a storm that's there that's lasting for a week, you'll sit in Islamabad. But like if I go over there with Graham or others, we sit there and kind of make a pledge to ourselves before we go that we're going to just stay in Islamabad till we can fly, because we've promised each other and our families and everybody that we're not going to take these roads that I don't think are, nobody can guarantee your security.
So let's go back a little bit again to kind of a little bit of a bigger question. It's funny because I wrote this question down here and I thought of it last night while reading your book. It's kind of a joke, but I wrote it down as this: what is wrong with you? And the reason is because, reading your book, and it's an expedition by expedition, this kind of arc you said as you learned more, and maybe your success rate didn't always follow that directly, but the amount of suffering, Steve, and you're kind of the first really avid high altitude guy I've ever had on the show. I've had Conrad on. He's not kind of the same one after another the way you've been. And a few other guys that go to some altitude, but the suffering that goes on. So I want to get into that if you don't mind, because I'm just a rock climber. And so what do you think, before you answer that question necessarily, what do you think in your early days, or as you were getting into climbing and you were going to Alaska and things like that, can you talk a little bit or codify or put into words this drive that you had that just wanted to go to these bigger and bigger mountains?
I think that when I was a little kid, I kind of grew up, in the 60s. It was kind of in the middle of the space race. And the big deal for all of us little kids when we were running around is that, these rockets are blasting off, the astronauts, and this is all the, the right stuff, kind of stories, that are just sort of happening all around us and in the news. All those people were our heroes. All these guys getting blasted off in rockets. It seemed like such a big adventure. And I wanted to lead this life of adventure and exploring from when I was a little kid. And I wanted to go to the moon. I wanted to be one of those guys. But I got a little older, and I'm kind of like, there's only like 4 or 5 of those guys that are doing it. It's probably not going to be me. And so I started looking around in books, and I saw these people climbing big mountains, and I go, well, that looks like the most otherworldly thing that you could possibly have, that I know I can go do that. I got super interested in big mountain environments, from when I was a little kid, and kind of started finding places I could get.
Where were you?
I was in Seattle.
Okay. So yeah, you were among mountains.
And, I found, friends of mine that were in the Boy Scouts, and I kind of joined up with that and got into backpacking and winter camping. And then when I was 14, one of the kids' dads started taking us climbing. So I was doing all those volcanoes in the Northwest, like Mount Rainier. And I climbed Mount St. Helens was my first climb back in 1968, when that was before it blew up. And so I always kind of had this desire in the back of my mind. I wanted to go climb these big peaks. It seemed like such a big adventure. All these local people that, you could see these pictures of these expeditions going with all their porters. It seemed so exotic, that I really, that was I wanted to do. And
did your family or have any background in that? You were just the black sheep. You were trying to do this on.
No. They I came from a big family, and my parents were all concerned that my siblings were gonna get drunk and crash the car, or one of my sisters was gonna get pregnant as a teenager, and they had to kind of watch out for those kinds of situations with teenagers. And I'm going climbing, and they thought it was just healthy, being in the outdoors. My mom used to say when I'd get in the car with my friends and wave goodbye and say, have fun hiking with the ropes.
Right.
They had no idea what we were doing.
Okay. And what was that first exposure? How did you find it? Was it Boy Scouts? Was it?
Well, from Boy Scouts, and then when we
yeah.
got to drive, then we'd sort of just go ourselves.
Okay.
And back then, this was like in the late '60s, early '70s. There wasn't really any place to go for people to teach you. We just sort of teach ourselves.
Okay.
So when some of these books started coming out, like Rel Robbins' Basic Rockcraft or, Advanced Rockcraft, I mean, those are big deals for us because it really we would learn from books, and, there were no YouTube videos kind of showing us how to do it.
So yeah, let's skip into the future now. Get more towards my problem I have with all this stuff is I use this word suffering, and the word gets thrown around in the business, as it were. I think to some, it's criticized because, well, what is true suffering? Imagine living in Somalia or whatever. But this idea of returning as often as you have and as regular as you do it, I think that's kind of one of the things that sets you apart and gains you a ton of respect out there. Is this longevity, literally, like you're alive, which, as we know, can be unusual for someone who's put himself at risk as much as you have in the mountains. But also just the fact that you've stayed just passionate about going up high and being on these trips. So knowing that and getting into it and realizing that, some of each one of these trips is, what we would look at as being miserable. How do you look at it, and how do you sort of compartmentalize this idea that, I'm going into this place, I know some of these days are going to be brutal. We just know that. Where does that desire come from, or how do you compartmentalize it? Or maybe you don't look at it like that. You just look at it as an athletic endeavor.
I think the experience is so amazing. It's so ethereal. You get up really high. It's dreamlike. It's dreamy. And the size and the scale of this environment that you're in is so massive, and it's so much bigger than anything in the world, else in the world. And I just sort of love being in it. And the effort that it takes, to sort of get there. I mean, it takes effort to do anything that's, that's worthwhile. And to me, sometimes I think about when you're dealing with a lot of kind of physical discomfort or pain, when you're having to breathe that hard or move and it hurts, is that, I tell myself, pain's just a feeling.
Okay.
It's just a feeling.
Sure.
And it's not something that has to control you. It's a feeling, like if you're happy or you're sad, and if there's some kinds of pain that you really have to pay attention because something's wrong, and there's other kinds of discomfort that you have when you're working hard at something that you want to do. That is just part of it. And then I really kind of try to embrace it. And then as I get older, I'm like, how lucky am I to still be able to do this? Because, it hurts, but there's going to be a time not too long from now where I won't be able to do it. And I'll look back on those moments with a lot of envy.
The other, I guess, big kind of question that surrounds your career, and reading your book as well, because you fill in some of the details about your life outside of mountaineering as well, is the balance that you've created somehow in terms of having a family, having a career, which we talked about in the very beginning, and the frequency and the amount of expeditions that you've managed to go on over the years. I mean, it seems, again, like a lot of folks, a lot of climbers, they have a period in their life where, it's mountaineering, and eventually those other things catch up with them and then it slows down. It doesn't appear to happen to you. I mean, you're talking like the physical limit will be the end, not necessarily anything else in your life. Do you have a kind of overriding philosophy or method or idea about how you've managed to do this for so long, and keep these other parts of your life relatively intact? Well,
I mean, I think of for me that there's kind of three big things in my life that have meant everything to me, and that's been my family, my career that sort of was able to make everything happen, and the kind of experiences that I wanted to have in being close to nature, close to in this big mountain environment in a very intimate way, you know, and experience the kind of power and awe, you know, of that. And so it was just always kind of a juggling act between those three things. And oftentimes I felt like I was never doing a really, really good job with all three of them at the same moment. You know, it was like maybe I was doing really good with one of them, and the other two, well, I was kind of ignoring them. And then I kind of was always conscious of that, you know, so I wouldn't ignore one of those things for too much time, because if you did, then that's going to fall apart, you know. So it was just sort of kind of like trying to balance things between those, so that and it also meant that I couldn't do everything. You know, I couldn't go on every climbing trip that I wanted to do. You know, I mean, and in my career, people would come up and offer me promotions to do different things, and I'd tell them no. You know, I could have made a lot more money, but I knew that if I took that promotion, that meant that I had to travel all the time. I'd be getting on a plane Sunday night. I'd come back, you know, Thursday night. And then if I turned to my wife and kids and said, oh, I'm going to go climbing for the weekend, which meant I'm gone 100% of the time, that wasn't going to work. Right. So it was a balancing act. But I was pretty aware of what I could say yes to and what I could say no to, and to kind of be aware of that all the time, you know, and not get myself into too much trouble in any one particular area at a time.
So let me ask you the other side of this longevity question. And I believe I might have asked Conrad this as well, and some other climbers that I've had on. But then there's the actual literal longevity that you've had. And as a high altitude mountaineer, been close to tragedy, and there's just no doubt that it's sort of a part of the game after a while. But what do you think it is, if you can sum it up, or maybe if you're going to sort of toot your own horn or self-reflect, do you think there's anything other than luck that's gotten you through this? Do you have a characteristic that you rely upon in terms of risk assessment, in terms of your abilities to say no or what have you, that's gotten you to this point? Or do you think it's some part of it is the gods and rolling the dice and some fateful things?
I don't know, you know, I mean, maybe some people would disagree, but I think I'm pretty conservative, you know, about things that I will and I won't do. You know, I'm pretty methodical about how I go through this, you know, planning for these kinds of trips, you know, we talked about earlier, but also kind of about what I think dangers are that we have, and you know, we spend a lot of time, you know, trying to minimize those risks. And you know, I really won't go on any routes that have objective hazards where we're walking under seracs, or, you know, most of the stuff that we're climbing now is pretty steep, so, you know, we don't get so much of an issue with snow stability. Nothing's guaranteed, you know, in life, but, you know, I like to feel like I'm pretty careful. You know, the first couple of chapters in the book are all about failing. You know, from my first trip to the Karakoram in 1980 to the first big success we had in climbing the North Ridge of K2 in 1990. I mean, that was 10 years. And I didn't really have a lot of success in between on these big mountains. And so it was a pretty slow learning curve. And I think a lot of the things that really helped, you know, keep me safe over the years was really trying to think about that this is a long game. You know, this isn't something that this particular trip has to result in a success. And in fact, one of the things I talk about in my book is in that first 10-year period of trying all of these things, and we were failing, I could see that actually we were getting better and we were learning more about how to do it. And at a certain point, maybe about 2/3 of the way during that time period, I could see, oh yeah, this is going to happen. Okay. And I actually started enjoying it, because I was really enjoying just the process of learning and the journey itself. And I could see down the road that, oh yeah, if we just kind of keep doing things like this, it's going to result in success. And then we're going to have more success after that, because we know how to do this. And so, I mean, there's a certain amount of luck with you know, being in the wrong place at the wrong time, and we all can think of examples of that. One of the things we learn out of this is acceptance. Things can happen, you know, and in all kinds of strange ways, and not just in climbing. You know, we don't know why certain things happen in life, and sometimes we just have to accept them. But I think this has been as big a part my life as anything else that I'm doing, and I can't imagine myself not being able to go and have these adventures, if I was still capable of doing it. It's really, I get really excited still about doing it.
You've talked about this arc in the book, and what you're just saying just now is about learning and starting to enjoy that learning. And, I'm a huge evangelical for the climbing life and for what it brings you as a person and can expand into the rest of your life. And that's a little bit about what this podcast is about. But do you have any feelings about what you've taken from that part of your life? And you talked about 3 different things going on in your life that's informed maybe the way you've acted in those other 2 parts of your life. Are you able to point to lessons or just maybe growth that affected you elsewhere from being on these big expeditions and the closeness you had with your partners or whatever, or maybe the conflicts you had with your partners, those sorts of things?
Right. I think a lot of us, I don't care if you're a rock climber or if you're an alpinist or you do big mountains, that any particular project that you have or a goal you have to be like a big mountain or something like, all of those goals to me are simply just the inspiration that you have that keeps you going in the kind of life that you want to have. So for me, when I was 14, I explained that I wanted to lead this life of exploration and adventure. Well, every one of these trips, over the years has been, every one of these peaks it was a goal that inspired us to basically lead this life of adventure and exploring. Any one of those individual goals, in my mind, they're kind of meaningless. I don't care whether you climbed K2 Everest without oxygen or new routes or whatever. At the end of the day, it's sort of, those are the goals that help you to lead the kind of life that you want to lead.
Okay.
But one of the things that I didn't know when I was like 14 was that sort of process of having these goals to help you lead the life that you want to have, there's these values that just, I think, are a natural byproduct of that get instilled in you in the process that end up becoming probably even more valuable. And these are values like partnership and empathy and stewardship and fortitude, aka suffering,
right?
And the things that really make you the person that you are, because at the end of the day, if you climbed all this stuff and led this lifestyle and everybody thought you were a jerk, what good is it?
Right.
It's absolutely no good, and so really at the end of the day, it might seem like a very convoluted and weird path, but this sort of journey to lead the lives of, and to get motivated to these things, I feel like I've come away from it with kind of a set of values that really are at the end of the day, the things that I really want to achieve.
Right.
Because that takes work.
Right.
You don't just, we're all a work in progress, and how we become doesn't happen by just sitting around on the couch.
Occasionally we've talked on the show with either mountaineers or really obsessive climbers, or even we've just sort of theorized about a little bit of that obsession, of that draw to do these routes. And some climbers deal with it just fine. Others get drawn into, an obsessive thing that ends up as a dark part of life. Like you just said, you had 3 parts of your life and you occasionally had to ignore a couple, but you were aware enough to not let them go too far. But plenty of climbers, and I think, the history of mountaineering is littered with these sorts of stories of ignoring everything else and maybe, to your peril, as it were. Have you ever stopped at all and reflected on maybe I'm pushing too hard right now on this mountaineering thing? Or can you reflect on any lessons you saw from climbers around you that maybe were pushing, too hard and going into that place of unhealthy obsession?
To me, I think because I feel like I was trying to balance these kind of 3 parts of my life, it kind of made it so that, and if it was truly going to be a balance, so that the other if there was one that I was doing and the other 2 didn't just fall off a cliff, I had to kind of bounce around between them in a way where I could not get too obsessed with any one of them. Because if I did, then the other ones would fail. And as a result, I don't see myself as a climber where I achieved, the kind of, excellence, in terms of technical ability or, brilliance, that some other people that I know have. But at the same time, I've certainly hung around with enough angst-ridden, sort of narcissistic alpinists to sort of know that I don't want to be like that, And I feel like I ended up being sort of pretty happy with myself because
shame on you.
Yeah,
that's not what mountaineering is about. Didn't you read Kiss or Kill?
Yeah. I don't know. I think sort of having other aspects to my life besides just climbing kind of helped me put it in perspective. Which is really that it's just a sport. And seeing that at the end of the day, now that I'm sort of an old guy, and I can kind of see that what's really most important is that the values that the whole process helped instill in me along the way ended up being the most important, is that any one of these individual clients it doesn't matter that much.
Right.
And it makes it easier for me if I get into a situation where I don't like what I see, or I don't like what I'm doing, or I don't feel right about it. I can walk away from it, and it's not like some big traumatic thing for me, because for me it's just another little piece in the puzzle. That piece doesn't have to be put in the puzzle today. It can be tomorrow or the next day, or maybe never. The picture's still there, and that. So I don't feel like with climbing that I ever really experienced the dark side.
All right. And in the passing the torch idea, is that part of, I guess, the lessons that you're maybe wanting to instill in some of these younger climbers?
I don't know. They'll learn out of it just like I did. It'll be whatever it is for them. For me, I think I probably get more out of it than they do.
Right.
They may say they're getting a lot. Well, great. But I mean, for me to hang around with young people and go out and be going after these objectives still super inspiring for me, because they're trying to get after it, and they still like me hanging around with them. They think I can keep up, and how great is that?
Right.
I mean, I walk around every day and I just sort of pinch myself, because it's like my life turned out way better than I thought it would, from when I was a little kid. It was like when I was 14, sitting around just dreaming about climbing, I never thought in my wildest dreams that I would get to do as much stuff that I've done. So I'm just incredibly grateful, and grateful for the relationships. I get to hang out with some of the coolest people imaginable, and how great is that?
A little bit more about your climbing, and then I want to switch gears to maybe some of the political stuff with the book and the observations there. But as a climber, we talked a little bit about earlier your logistic sense, which has to make you extremely valuable on a expedition, because I imagine when you're compiling a team, there's folks that are good at that, and then there's folks that probably aren't as good at it and have been brought on for other reasons, so to speak. But as a climber and up on the climb, as it were, and some of the times in the book you talked about this being with George Lowe or these other people and swapping leads and trying to kind of prove yourself up there with those guys. What do you think is your strengths as a climber? Like what kind of climber are you up on the mountain when you get out and it's your turn to push new ground? Where do you think your strengths lie?
I think like on a big mountain, one of my probably strengths is that probably on physically is I can stay healthy enough to be a good contributor up high. I mean, as you probably read these stories in the book, especially some of the earlier ones where we had bigger expeditions, and also we were going for the first time, so they weren't necessarily with people who had proven experience at altitude. Huge attrition rate. Right. You could start out with a group of 8 or 10 people, and halfway through the trip, for various different, usually health-related reasons, you might only have 2 or 3 people that are still really active. Like on my first trip to K2 in 1986, we had, 6 or 8 people, climbers on that expedition, and at the end, it was just Alex Lowe, George Lowe, and me that were still really healthy enough to sort of keep going. And so I think that, so I think I'm reliable.
Okay.
I'm not necessarily going to be the most brilliant person. Like back in those days, if we would get to like a really hard technical pitch, I might just say to Alex, like, why don't you do that?
Sure.
You know,
yeah.
But
Just
then we might
slingshot
get
him
into
up
a
there.
situation, shoot him up. But then it would be sort of like, you know, he'd get all antsy and jumping around, and then I would say to him, well, just calm down, you know. We're just going to hang out here for a while, and then when it gets good, we'll go, you know, and we'll just play cards or something, you know. And I think that I see with a lot of climbers, it's really hard for them to play the long game. You know, these kinds of ventures are complicated in so many different ways, you know, politically, economically, you know, logistically, financially, and then just skill and experience wise, that if you want to really be successful on these kinds of objectives, it takes a while to kind of figure out how to put the pieces together, and you have to have the patience to do that. And I think that's one of my strengths.
Well, speaking of patience too, again, as a person who doesn't know this world that well, other than reading, I mean, I've read the books and all the classics and everything else, but the patience in the waiting game, I think, seems to get glossed over quite a bit. And even in like your book, you know, it's like I waited at you know, camp 3 for 2 days for everybody to return, or you know, 10 days here, and I just suddenly internalized it that, you know, you're in a crusty little tent in a storm or whatever, just hanging out, waiting for 48 hours. Like if you told me to wait in my living room for 48 hours, I'd lose my mind, you know, out of boredom. So, yeah. I mean, I don't really have a question here. Maybe you can comment on it, but just this idea of all this downtime on these mountains, and it's not downtime in like a pleasant place or even in a safe place necessarily. Like, I mean, that must be a part of your personality. I mean, what are you doing? Like, what's going on? Are you just able to just be internal for that whole time, and or you're busy heating water? And I mean, what's going on when you're just like 2 days in a tiny tent on a ridge somewhere waiting for somebody to show up?
Yeah, well, certainly on those earlier expeditions, with the big expeditions we had, that you know, we made the mistakes back then of like establishing these camps, and then when the weather would go bad, we would just hang out there and like do nothing, you know, or maybe you'd have a book with you, you know, to read. Kind of certainly in the last 20 years of these kinds of trips, we have a much stronger, you know, the strategy that we use is when the weather goes bad, you just go all the way to base camp. And then we're hanging out at base camp where we've got a cook, you know, you've got your base camp tent, we all have our own tent, and I've got my music, I've got all my books.
Sure.
A lot of, you know, frankly, a lot of the writing that I did for this book was on expeditions. I was sitting in there like typing away on my little computer. And frankly, you know, in my life, when I talked about sort of balancing these three things, when I would come back, you know, like to Seattle, you know, where I was working, and you know where Ann and I were raising our family, I was so busy all the time, you know, trying to juggle all these things that I never had any time to really think about anything. And I actually relished that time, you know, that downtime, because it was the only time in my life I could sit around in a tent for a week or something and read or write or just, you know, contemplate my navel, you know, just slowing everything down. And a lot of us, you know, run through life and we never actually kind of stand back and look at ourselves and say, do I like what I'm doing? You know, is this great? Am I psyched? You know, because you're so busy from the day to day, you're so busy dealing with stuff at sea level that you never kind of look at your life from 50,000 feet and say, hey, is this working the way I want it to be? And I really enjoyed actually sitting around and having opportunities to do that.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I felt like I've had times where getting on an overnight flight or like an 8-hour flight or 10-hour flight to Europe or something. It was actually something I was looking forward to. Yeah. You know, just to sit there and do nothing or read a book or whatever. Yeah. So I kind of get it. That's interesting. Yeah, and I was sort of more thinking about, like you said, the early days when you're just like, you know, on a ridge.
Yeah. Well, you know. That wasn't good, actually. That was not good, you know. But
so you guys figured it out.
We figured it out. It was part of the learning process because, I mean, the main thing that happens either at high altitude, if you get stuck for a period of time at high altitude, you just your body just decays. You know, the higher you are, the more time you spend higher up. You know, it's kind of like you go on these trips and you come and you're really fit. You get acclimatized. You reach this peak level of acclimatization and you still have your fitness. But then it peaks out and then it drops off because your body's decaying at altitude. And if you're too far down that backside, by the time you try to go to the summit, you're not going to make it because you're too tired. Mm-hmm. And what I learned, especially from some of those early trips, is that we were spending too much time high up on the mountain, and it was really accelerating that decay curve, for us, so that, like in '86, when Alex, George, and I were trying to make a summit attempt on K2 in early August of 1986, we were already way down the other side of that sort of decay curve, and probably one of the big reasons why he didn't make it.
Right. So let's switch gears for the last bit of this to kind of your theme in your book, Climbing Through Conflict is the subtitle, right? Is that it?
Climbing Through the Kashmir Conflict.
Kashmir Conflict. And it started with the Kashmir Conflict, and then in addition to that, it's morphed into the post 9/11 world over there, and the influence from Afghanistan, and all the myriad of things that are going on with tribal conflict and religious conflict and all these things. So, but to start with, like, what was it about the Balti and what's the other culture? Yeah, cultures that blew your mind or attracted you initially? Because the praise for that in your book is clear about their culture and what's enticing about it or what you admire about it.
Well, I mean, these people are incredibly capable of surviving and living in these villages at high altitude in this incredibly rugged mountain landscape that just makes them really rugged, tough people. Mm-hmm. I mean, by our living standards, to kind of see how they survive, kind of from year to year, it's quite daunting and quite amazing to me, and especially on the early trips that we went there. I mean, some things have changed, that some of these villages have gotten road access and things have improved for them, but I mean, early on, we would go through some of these villages and people would be like hardly seen foreigners before. Mm-hmm. We'd run into these incredible health problems that they were having, and so I just and in spite of the fact that they had nothing, the thing that really impressed me about them is that they wanted to give everything they had to you. Mm-hmm. I hardly know my neighbor across the street.
Sure.
Where I live in Seattle. And these people, I'm a stranger walking through, or the people that are staff, they just met me. I think it's this philosophy that kind of builds up in these villages where people have to rely on each other so much for their survival and dependent on each other for survival that there is this kind of mutual giving. They're in it together, kind of how can we help each other? Mm-hmm. And as I think that for all of us, as we acquire more resources, more things where we can live independent lives, it really kind of shifts our perspective from one of, kind of mutual helping to, hey, I'm just in this for me. Mm-hmm. I don't want to pay my taxes. I don't want to if there's money for the school kids and I don't have any kids, well, why should I pay any of that? I mean, and it's just so different, mm-hmm. And we have so much, and I think that this dichotomy.
Yeah, it's like really a paradox. Like the more we have, the less we want to give it, and the less they have, the more they give it. Right?
That's exactly right, and it's just so it just it blows you away.
Sure. And what is their attitude towards climbing and towards what you guys are up to? And I say this because in past shows, like Stacy Bear was a guest on the show, and he went to Angola, and the people there in these villages just couldn't believe that they'd showed up just to climb rocks, right? Like, what a strange thing to do. And in some of the stories in your book, the folks, your cooks and the people and the liaison officers on your trips get very excited about your success and very concerned about your safety. But in general, were you surprised at their attitude towards what you guys were up to, or did you find more people were mystified than maybe I'm reading into, or is this like a thing that they just understand? It's like, well, you're here to do this adventure thing, and our lives are similar alike.
I don't know. I think my experience with them is that for the most part, it kind of depends on how well educated and what their individual lives are like. I mean, some of these people in the villages are so poor that just just getting through the day or getting through the next year and trying to make sure that their children survive just takes up all their time. But then most of the people that we're working with are probably the more well-off people in the village that are starting to get some money from tourism. They may be a little better educated. They seem to pretty much get it. I mean, They grew up in these villages. I mean, I love this story because Nazir Sabir, who's probably the most famous Pakistani climber, did first ascent of the west face of the K2 with Japanese in 1981. First Pakistani to climb Mount Everest. He's a celebrity guy there. He's been a friend of mine there since my first trip in 1980. And I was doing an interview with Nazir a few years ago, and I said, well, how did this get all... And Nazir grew up in one of these tiny little villages in Hunza. And I asked him, I said, well Nazir, what got you into this? Like, why did you want to start climbing the mountains from being a little sheep herder kid, in the village? And he said, well, these big mountains surrounding me when I was a little kid herding the goats, I thought if I got to the top of one of these mountains, I'd be able to see America. I mean, to them back then, America represented just sort of the world.
Right.
It was very far away, and it's like big rich country or whatever. But it was just, for him, it was like climbing up the mountains would give them the vision and be able to see and have exposure to the rest of because these people they want to have a life of adventure and exploring too, and see what the rest of the world is. And they grew up sort of trapped up in these big little mountain valleys, and they don't have a lot of opportunity. And so in some ways, a lot of those little kids, growing up, they kind of see their mountains and their environment around them as opportunity and ways to get to see the rest of the world. And in Nazir's case, that's true. And then also, that they just live in the mountains there, and they have to do a lot of the same stuff that we do,
Right.
I mean, we call it scrambling. Like you can go pick up the guidebook that says scrambling in the Rockies, that you go, some people do on the weekend for fun. Well, what they do every day is scramble.
Right.
They're out there with their goats and doing stuff, and they're scrambling. And so, what they do in some respects is mountain climbing every day, but on just kind of a different level.
And you said by and large, those cultures are removed from a lot of the political conflict that's going on in that part of the world.
Yeah. And the mountains act as kind of a barrier
to
that keeps them isolated from that. And they're a completely different religious and tribal group from what I would call sort of the bad guys there. And they suffer more than we do by, there was a whole busload of these Baltis and Burkashi from Gilgit Hunza that were taking a bus back to Islamabad, going over the Babasar Pass, and a bunch of these Pashtun Sunnis pulled them off the bus and shot them all. So they're victims of sectarian violence that's directed at them because they're the minorities there. And as you probably read in the newspapers and stuff, there's gotten to be a big increase in the amount of sectarian violence that's occurring. And if you're the minority, the majority is always going to be running around saying, well, we've got the right way of thinking about this and you don't, and you guys are we need to get rid of those people over there who don't believe in Islam the right way. And so they're kind of isolated up in there, and they kind of get pretty gripped when they leave from there, because then they're going to be surrounded by people that they actually perceive as having the potential to cause them harm.
Right. So, you talked at one point in the book, I can't remember the expedition, maybe it was Everest actually, where as a lot of mountaineers, alpinists in your cohort at some point confronted big commercial style expedition climbing and got enough of a taste of it to say, I'm not going to do this anymore. Is that right? It was the Everest trips?
Yeah.
With Sandy Pittman and the whole thing.
Right.
You were involved in all that, kind of in a peripheral way. And looking at the nature of Everest climbing now and the influence of Western tourism on Nepal, for better or worse, what is your feeling about sort of the insertion of Western technology ideas, people into this part of the culture, even at a limited basis, although there's some, it's fairly frequent, or at least it has been in the past, if it's slowed down right now. Do you see it as a positive thing, as a neutral thing, or are there negative parts about this idea of, flashy mountaineers showing up in these places?
Well, that's a really complicated question, and I think
we have 2 minutes left. You're fine. Just well, your experience,
and there's good things and bad things. The good things is it provides them with economic opportunity, and I think the Westerners that go there, they're wanting to have their adventure. It gives them sort of an opportunity to do something that they're psyched about. I think that the downside is how are these local communities, their culture, how's that being preserved? And the other thing is, especially on these peaks like Everest, where you're putting, the local population, doing a lot of the heavy lifting, and especially through dangerous areas like on Everest, the Khumbu Icefall, I think if you ran the numbers, probably a lot of these Sherpas are making way more trips through the Khumbu Icefall than the Westerners do, and is that ethical?
Mm-hmm.
So, I think there's things like that I think people need to think about, and I don't think there's a right or wrong answer. It's not something that really appeals to me, because to me it doesn't feel like the kind of adventure and exploring that I wanted to do from when I was a little kid. But for some other people, that is very much in line with what they want. And it kind of just depends on the person too. I've seen some people, they come away from those experiences. When I have conversations with them, I'm like, wow, that was a really cool guy. A really, really cool person. They made a lot out of that experience. Mm-hmm. And then sometimes I'll run into people, they'll do that, and all they want to do is come back and just tell everybody about what they did, mm-hmm. and think that everybody's going to think they're wonderful because they climbed Mount Everest, and which, in my opinion, is not so cool.
Right.
And I think we just need to be careful.
A couple of last questions about your position now as a possible inspiration for younger climbers, and I've asked this to other climbers as well. You look at your 14-year-old kid that you keep referencing, and he'd probably be amazed to know that you're now, someone who younger climbers look up to, the way you probably read about and looked up to the mountaineers of the 60s and 70s. So could you, and this may be a long answer too, but maybe not, folks going over there, to these young climbers who are inspired to go over to Skardu and go into this part of the world, what would you say could be like a quick tip, rundown, shakedown on conduct and the way you think that they should be traveling through that part of the world, in terms of again, this inserting a foreigner into a very kind of set old culture that's up in these mountains?
Well, I think that if you have a set of values when you go over there in the first place, which is, that you treat everybody with respect. It doesn't matter how poor they are, or whether the thing they're doing for you is just a little thing or a big thing. One of the things that we always do over there that actually people don't do so much anymore is that we've always run our own trips. We hire an adventure tour company, but it's pretty common right now for, if you were going to go to a mountain in Pakistan, you say, I want to go here, and you talk to your adventure tour company, and they'd say, okay, it's going to be $5,000 a piece. You write them a check for that, and then they just take care of everything. Mm-hmm. We don't do that. What we do is we go over there, we have them help us a little bit, but then when we hire our porters, I pay the porters the money. Mm-hmm. It comes from me or Graham or Chris or Scott or somebody so you have that kind of relationship with them where you're working with them. You're not isolated from them. So I would really encourage people, if they're going to these places in the world, don't let your adventure tour companies do everything for you, because you're cheating yourself of a big part of the experience to really be able to get to know the local people you're working with by having your hired help do all that stuff for you. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing I would say to young people going and climb. I don't care whether it's there or any place else. We always have kind of a little motto, before we head out on the climb. And I don't know, it came from maybe one of my heroes from back in the 60s or 70s who said that when we go to the mountains, we come back safe, we come back friends, and we go to the summit. And in that order, in terms of priorities.
Sure.
So it's like, the most important thing is you got to come back alive, and what good is it if you get to the top and you come back and you all hate each other, you got to find some way of working things out with your partners in a way where, everybody is feeling like, they're an important contributor to whatever it is that you're doing. And at the end of the day, if you can get to the top of the thing, great, but you don't always. You can always come back.
All right, Steve, well, thanks for sitting down. And I know it was a little complicated to get this done, but you somehow ended up in Carbondale.
Yeah, so thank you. I'm as happy to do it. It's perfect. Yeah.
And I look forward to your talk tonight. Hope to get up there. And if anybody is out there and wants to learn so much more, the book is Karakoram,
Climbing Through the Kashmir Conflict.
Climbing Through the Kashmir
Mountaineers
Conflict.
Books just came out in April this year.
Okay, so it's out. It can be found at your... Is there any place you can buy books anymore, or is it all online?
Well, you can buy it online from Mountaineers Books,
cool.
which is kind of cool because you're supporting a small publisher. You can also go to the Evil Empire and order it on Amazon,
Right.
Probably for a few dollars cheaper. But I will have to make a nice plug for Mountaineers Books here. They're probably the largest English language publisher of books in this genre in the world, and it's a really tough business, and they really need our support, because if it wasn't for them, this story would not be getting told.
Right.
And if you like hearing these kinds of stories and you want to read about these kinds of stories, support these publishers who are putting these stories out there, and do that by buying their books.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot for that, and thanks for sitting down, Steve.
Thank you.
Okay, folks, thanks for listening, and thanks to Steve Swenson for swinging through Carbondale and sitting down. Sorry about my cough and that thing. It's been nagging me all spring. Anyway, remember that if you want to help out the Enormocast, you can go to enormocast.com, click on the Help Out tab, and follow the directions. Write a review at iTunes, like the Facebook page, donate some money if you feel like it. Whatever you want to do, remember to tell your friends. Still some folks out there never heard of this thing. Please let them know. All right, then. Get out there. Have some fun. Be safe. Talk to your partner. Use your signals. Communicate. And, of course, check your knot.
Fear is the path to the dark side. Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering.